மறக்காம சர்ப்ரைஸ் பண்ணுங்க. Thank you.
Welcome to the second chapter in our course on the Caro Kann defense. In the first chapter, we looked at the continuation where, after e4, c6, d4, d5, white exchanges on the d5 square, and we looked at the exchange variation, which is characterized by white playing bishop d3 and then developing his pieces in the London formation, so to speak. And in the second chapter, we will be continuing examining the move pawn takes d5, and now examine another one of white's key options, which is the move c4. And this is an introduction to the Panov Botvinnik attack, which is a very famous, of course, variation with a lot of pedigree. And it's a very famous variation. First of all, it carries the name of a particularly very great player, Mikhail Botvinnik, of course, former world champion who pioneered a lot of theory and a lot of our understanding of IQP positions. And this opening commonly reaches these aforementioned IQP isolated queens pawns positions. Now, the way that the game here often proceeds and what white is hoping for is knight f6, knight c3, and now black plays this move e6 to defend the center, but simultaneously also blocks in this bishop on c8. After a further, for example, knight f3, bishop e7, bishop to d3, pawn takes c4, pawn c4, castles, a very typical type of position is reached with white possessing an isolated pawn on d4, but in turn having the open e file, the half-open e file rather, the open c file, and chances to create a kingside attack with a multitude of maneuvers. There's of course the famous battery attempt on this diagonal, and of course the position has been examined many times, and as a fundamental position that almost all master level players have looked at some point or another in order to enrich their understandings of this very famous pawn structure. So this is generally what white is going for. When he plays the Panov Botvinnik attack, he wants to play he's already showing his willingness to play an IQB position, and in general positions that give white pretty good attacking chances and requires at times pretty deep knowledge. And so basically white is perfectly happy to play with a structural concession, this isolated pawn on d4, and in turn get some dynamic play. Now in this position, black universally plays knight f6, after which white universally plays knight c3. And here we are at a crossroads, and I will be showing you here what my recommendations are. Now, the move e6, as I mentioned, is the most popular approach here leading to these very famous IQP positions, but personally I've actually never ventured to play this way, because I feel like that's exactly what my opponent wants, and I was always more attracted to black's other options. Now, my main recommendation, and the variation that I've been playing as of late, and in fact I've been playing this variation, I believe, for about maybe 5-6 years now, is the move g6, this kingside fianchetto. Of course, some shades of some variations we looked at in the exchange Caro Kann, and the idea here is quite ambitious. My idea is that I want to develop my pieces in such a way that would be perfectly aligned to combat this isolated pawn. Meaning that, unlike this move e6, where I block in this bishop, I want to play g6, get my bishop to g7 where I'm attacking this weakness, keep this diagonal open for my bishop, and for example, if white doesn't really do anything and just develops normally, then I'm going to have a reverse Rosh system, which is a reverse Rosh opening, which is a defense black may employ against white when he plays d4. And well, this type of position is considered very powerful against an isolated pawn, since there's a lot of pressure against it here. So this is my goal. Of course, if white reacts correctly here and plays the move queen b3, which is considered the most testing option, pressuring this pawn on d5, then the game takes a different turn. What usually happens here is black sacrifices the central pawn, seeing that if he captures, then it's difficult to defend f7 without playing e6, creating a bunch of dark square weaknesses. And of course the move e6 also creates these dark square weaknesses. So black is obliged more or less to play bishop g7, pawn takes d5, castle. And now black's goal will be to regain this pawn either with the knight going to b6, or the knight potentially going to c7, and black is hoping to get this pawn back and then enjoy playing against white's weak isolated d4 pawn. So this is a very interesting variation. It's considered a very dynamic choice for black because it's actually sort of like a gambit, but it's positionally founded. In most variations, we are going to try to regain our pawn and simply put pressure against this weakness on d4 that white is creating so early in the game. And I've done quite well with this variation. I found that many of my opponents are not particularly familiar with this line because it's not as popular as e6 or as knight c6, which is the other main option for black here. And sometimes my opponents have an idea of what to do. They know they're supposed to capture the d5 pawn, try to hang on to it, but oftentimes they do not have any specific variations planned. And very often I was able to simply get a positional advantage quite easily from the opening. So this move g6 will be my main recommendation. However, I will also be presenting another option here that we will look at first. It's a surprise weapon that I've used myself when I was first starting out with the Kann, and I was a national master / expert. And I've used this variation actually a little bit later in my career as well as a surprise weapon. That variation is knight c6, which is actually one of the main moves, so this is not the surprise yet. Sensibly developing the knight and adding some pressure to d4. Now, white has two continuations, and those are bishop g5, which is a very aggressive, dynamic development, and knight f3, which is a bit of an older move, which leads to either complications or a very famous endgame if black goes bishop g4, which I'm actually not going to get into here. So here's my surprise suggestion. After this move, knight f3, I'm suggesting this rare but pretty decent move, scoring pretty well, bishop to e6, which is kind of a funky move, but the idea here is to force white to sort of clarify this tension in the center, either having white take on d5 and then giving us clear-cut play against this d4 pawn, or more commonly, white plays this move c5, fixing the pawn structure. Now we can play g6, so sort of similar to the variation I was just talking about with the kingside fianchetto, Caro, except in this case, white has lost the option of pressuring this pawn on d5, so black may get a very good pressure against this pawn on d4 by very simple developing moves. So this is a variation that I'd like to have a look at, and I believe it's quite underrated, not played very often, but carries a good element of surprise and some good chances to trick your opponents early on. And the other variation we'll be examining after bishop g5 is a very rare move that I prepared around 4 years ago, 3-4 years ago, when I was playing the very strong US Junior Championship, and I didn't have a chance to play this at the board, but the variation here is the move knight e4. A very surprising lunge with the knight, and the idea here, the most popular continuation, the most thematic play here, is where white captures the knight, pawn takes, now the pawn on d4 is hanging, so e4 and now knight e5. And in this variation, it's a very rare variation. I do not believe anyone below really the grandmaster level is too familiar with this variation from white's point of view. And it's a very dynamic option where black is hoping to use this pawn on e4, which is preventing white's pieces from developing. He's hoping to use this sort of very annoying pawn in order to build a quick initiative, oftentimes with moves like queen b6 or queen a5. Sometimes we will see this idea of g6, bishop g7, again getting some pressure on this long diagonal, and some ideas of playing even e6 or f6, which is looking a little ugly, but as we will see, can be a really strong move to gain some time. And in general, another variation that I believe is not only a decent weapon at club level, where players will be completely unfamiliar with, but also a decent surprise weapon for any level. With that being said, we're now going to jump into all of these variations, and I hope you enjoy navigating these surprise weapons in the Panov and all of these kingside fianchetto.
மறக்காம சர்ப்ரைஸ் பண்ணுங்க. Thank you.